And that's what I think would be really powerful, is if we can create more of those systems where it's self-discovery more so than, well, here's your 5 sets of 5. Here's your, VBTs. Here's your, because those are going to go up in time, but like just put in an environment where they can actually, so they can have actualization within themselves and self-discovery so that they can get better. Not necessarily like, oh man, because I assure you this, when I saw squat numbers go up, when I saw force plate numbers go up, I did not see wins go up like that. And if that's what's most important at the end of the day, then, that's what we're trying to do here.
That was Cory Schlesinger, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, SimpliFaster. There are a lot of sports technology companies out there, but SimpliFaster is the only website you can go to that features an online store that covers the bandwidth of training technology, from force plates to timing systems to muscle stimulators and more. Some products of SimpliFaster that I use and love include things like the Freelap timing system in kBox, or coaches' favorites such as GymAware. Recently, SimpliFaster has added 2 units that as a coach you should definitely take a look at. The first is the Muscle Lab Contact Grid, which is an extremely affordable and portable, step-by-step, literally, system to collect data on jumps, bounds, sprints, agility, hurdle hops, and really as much as your creative mind can imagine. In what used to take a whole runway worth of data collecting strips, the Contact Grid does it all with only 2 small strips that together cover up to 40 meters of sprinting. Ground contact time, step rates, rhythms, and beyond are at your fingertips with this device. Another new unit, the VO2 Master, is an ultra-portable gas exchange analyzer. Don't guess on energy system development when you can get direct insight into VO2 capabilities in relation to specific sports skills, rather than being hooked up to tubes on a treadmill, or worse yet, a cycle ergometer to get a VO2 max. Think of the VO2 Master as your own gas exchange lab without the tubes and wires. Deepen your analysis in the specific conditioning preparation of your athletes with the VO2 Master today. These products and incredible customer service make SimpliFaster your go-to for your sports technology needs. I'm happy to have partnered with them in sponsoring this podcast. Their support has been tremendous, so check them out today at SimpliFaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Welcome to another episode of the show. I know if you've been following this show, you've probably caught a couple of the Q&As that I've put on. And I decided it's time to not just do them myself, because, I enjoy answering questions, but in addition to having to kind of check and make sure I'm not double or triple covering an old question, I just thought it'd be more fun to get more minds involved in this segment of the show. And I always enjoy, whether it be an episode with 3 people or 4, generally speaking, the more people in the conversation, it's always a good thing. And also, I just love talking to Cory. So I wanted to get him involved on the Q&A here. Just a quick background, too, for those of you guys who aren't too familiar with Cory and his work. He is the head strength and conditioning coach for the Phoenix Suns. He spent the previous 3 years as the head of basketball athletic performance for Stanford University. He was involved at a couple D1 schools before that. He's also trained pro athletes, Olympians, and is just overall a coach, and is overall a coach who is incredibly creative, but also is incredibly practical and athlete-centered in the way that he views the training of the athlete. Cory's a guy who not only has a great mind for the strength element of things, but also played basketball on the college level and is continually looking at a more zoomed-out view of what training athletes means in context of becoming a better player. So for the show, we took you guys' questions on social media. A lot of them were directed towards specifically Cory's views on athlete autonomy and his training system, but also some great questions on isometrics, foot training, combining strength with sports skill training, and more. This was a really fun show. And I will say, definitely the questions were probably a little bit more geared towards Cory's neck of the woods, which is awesome. Honestly, I would just as well consider this a second interview with Cory, just as much as a Q&A. It's just fun to answer these questions alongside him. So for episode 211, let's get on to this Q&A with myself and Cory Schlesinger. All right, we got a special Q&A today. I was sick of just doing it myself, and so I'm super excited to have Cory here. So welcome to the Q&A, Cory.
Hey, glad to be here, bro.
All right. Well, so let's get rolling. Thanks for everyone who popped questions. I think we just asked them on Instagram this time instead of some different mediums. Usually that's where most of them come from anyway. So let's kick it off. Acceleration, Randy Peterson, thanks for the question. He asked about the utility of ground-based strength, tumbling, crawling, rolling, wrestling with pro athletes. And so maybe this could be framed too, like a college versus pro, or as you work through the levels. What do you think about that one, Cory, in different populations?
It's interesting because everyone, no matter what, if you're a professional, if you're an amateur, they all fit on a spectrum of their own developments. So like taking a broad, like, okay, is tumbling good for professional athletes? Yes, if they're lacking certain things. And then the same with amateurs. Yes, if they're lacking certain things. But what you got to look at it more so, in my opinion, is you got to just do a needs analysis and where that athlete is currently. It's not this cutoff point where all of a sudden they're professional, so they don't need to do X, Y, or Z. Or they're an amateur, so they have to do X, Y, and Z. You have, beautifully gifted genetic athletes who don't need a lot of our work, to be 100% honest. And so then you skip a lot of those steps, or you have more strategies in place to keep them playing or keep them doing the things that make them awesome on the court or on the field. And then you have some that are like, well, they're grinders, or they're the ones that constantly need that training stimulus or that controlled stimulus to help them develop or stay more robust. And those athletes are the ones that, yeah, maybe they do need more quote unquote ground-based work, or they need more skill acquisition, not from a skill perspective on the court, but just from a human perspective. And that's where, for me, it's everybody across the board. I don't care if you're, a child going through your DNS, stages, or you're an elite level athlete who's 7 foot tall and can do a backflip dunk. All of them need some form or fashion of tools that will allow them to get in and out of scenarios via falling, which everyone in some point will go through, or being ground based and being able to stabilize and being able to express, or not only express forces, but also be able to how should I say this, to be able to sustain them, to be able to or accept them, and to be able to redirect them. And that's where, I think there's a question that was presented earlier with the Franz Bosch, how should I say this, influence. And it's like, yeah, some of these things are just self-organizing. And that's what I think tumbling comes into the equation is, yeah, man, you're just giving them exposures on how to self-organize in areas that might not be what their normative values are, aka playing basketball on a hardwood surface, which requires a ton of stiffness. How about we actually teach them how to fall and get more compliant so they can keep receiving those forces?
Yeah, that teaching how to fall makes me too think about, like, so much about, we talk about rate of force and force production. We just think, dead stop, go, like, or max stiffness. But the yielding element doesn't, I think, come necessarily as naturally on people's radar. But it's like, yeah, you got to learn to yield, and you have to have both sides of the equation. You said something, and I was kind of intrigued by it, in the idea of, like, you talked about people who are real skilled versus the grinders. And I look at, like, some of my athletes, and I look at the ones who are, especially at tennis, a team that I've worked a lot in the last 8 years. And I noticed that the guys who are the most skilled on the court tend to be really good at cartwheels and crawling and monkey bars and all that stuff. And the grinders, the people who are more of that grinder type, tend to not quite be as good at that. And so are you saying that from a needs analysis, if I'm like looking at the pyramid, and you look at, like, are there bricks missing in the foundation? Like, this person never probably did that stuff when they were a kid. They use more of just a grind your way through it, force your way through it period of time. So you're saying the less skilled players you would, I should say the people who miss those skills, a little bit less, just skill oriented, you would use it more with them versus the players who are just super freak athletics. Like, maybe they don't need some of that stuff as much. Is that what you're saying?
So I would say it like this, and this comes from, and something that me and you talked extensively about, is the experience, right? And certain people need experiences that they just need exposure to, whether it's a new experience or it's an experience that gives them a lot of confidence. So what I mean by that is the example you gave, the really skillful athletes that are good at tennis, they just so happen to be good at monkey bars and all these other athletic endeavors. But at the same time, that's what makes them confident too. So, exposing them to those things, but it's all in the spectrum of what is needed and how much of a dosage, if you will, or a percentage of the training you're going to do with that particular individual. Your grinders, once again, like what makes them confident? What makes them confident is squat and heavy weight, generally. And so you got to give them that, because from a neck up standpoint, that's what makes them confident in what they do. But then you got to find, okay, what percentage do I expose them to the things they're not so good at, which could be the tumbling, the cartwheeling, the monkey bars, etc. Because you want to make their human capacities better. And when you have your super skillful athletes, the ones that are great at the tumbling, the anything that's just relative in their own body, when you add those external resistance, like those heavy loads, and all of a sudden you see, it's like a negative response. They're almost like, oh my God, like this is terrible for me. And you can see it in their face. And they're like, well, okay, I need to give only 5 to 10% of that stuff. And I might need to do it in a form or fashion where it makes them a little bit more comfortable so they can actually load it. And then with your grinders, you go, okay, you know what? Maybe just warm ups, you're doing monkey bars. And then your meat and potatoes, you're getting awesome. You're doing the things that make you feel super confident and moving weights and bars are bending and all that type of stuff. But I think the biggest problem, and this is just me digressing, but I think the biggest problem in our field is that people need to be able to systemize this, or people need to put this in like sets and reps, and it's got to be quantified, and all these things have to be in place to see athletic performance. You have to find a way to validate your job objectively. You got to do all these things. And it's like, what if we just valued it in it as did they have a good experience? Like, did they actually come out of the weight room feeling better than they came in? Is there progressive overload? Well, yeah, that's the only thing that matters. Because let's look at it from a time perspective, not, oh man, did his force plate numbers change? Like, don't get me wrong, we get excited about those things. But those same things is what puts us in a box that says we need this objective measure. We need this output so that we can say, man, look at us do our job. And it's like, you know what? Maybe it's more so we create an environment for them to learn themselves, for them to be able to navigate. And, you just leave breadcrumbs to where you think they need to go, but they're the ones that are dictating it. And that's what I think would be really powerful, is if we can create more of those systems where it's self-discovery more so than, well, here's your 5 sets of 5. Here's your, VBTs. Because those are going to go up in time, but like just put in an environment where they can have actualization within themselves and self-discovery so that they can get better. Not necessarily like, oh man, because I assure you this, when I saw squat numbers go up, when I saw force plate numbers go up, I did not see wins go up. Like that. And if that's what's most important at the end of the day, then that's what we're trying to do here. And so that's where I want the experiences where years later I kid you not, I had a kid who's now a neurosurgeon. He's brilliant. I love this kid, but he was one of my first athletes at Santa Clara University, and he still goes, I swear, he hit me up 2 days ago saying, I just did Dyno 1, which is this warm up that I literally made up on the fly. It's a dynamic warm-up routine. He's like, dude, I still do that to this day. So, that's cool, man. I gave him an experience and he took it with him for the rest of his life. Like, these are the things that I want to celebrate more so than I want to celebrate, oh man, his eccentric RFD is through the roof now because we did X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 blah,
I love that, man. I almost think, in some way the level, and again, it's how you can quantify this if we look at this research in psychology, I guess you can quantify it, but if you quantified your work by the smile on an athlete's face and their confidence, right? And what if some people would probably call this heresy, but what if we rebranded being a strength coach to like physical athlete experience facilitator or something like that?
I don't hate that. I don't hate that one bit, because if that's what we're trying to do, like if you're in a college setting, you got 4 years with athletes, it better be a great experience. Like, your world better be a great experience. That better be a part of their life, because that's part of their development, not only from their neck down, but their neck up. In the professional setting, you have a smaller window, and that's okay. And these are things that now that I'm in the professional setting, I'm truly confidently finding means and methods that are truly minimal effective dosage, that are like, okay, this is like the minimal amount of work that this athlete needs to do to have the quote unquote stress response adaptation. And that's always a changing spectrum, but it's what are the things that I'm doing that makes them want to come back? What are the things that I'm doing to create consistency? Because I do not care what program you are writing and what you're trying to accomplish. The only variable that will show change over time is consistency and intent. And if I don't have those, it doesn't matter what program I wrote for 6 weeks. It doesn't matter what exercise selection I do. What matters is them continuously coming through the door day in and day out.
And that experience it's key. That's the absolute foundation. I really like what you said, Cory, about, because it makes me think about my emphasis is I think it's very easy to, like, for me, I love anything that's like athletic in the sense of cartwheels and crawls and every variation. And I make warm-ups up on the fly all the time based off that stuff and try to challenge athletes in new ways. And I'll be like, I'll put like a dowel out in the middle of the weight room and say, find a creative way to get over this, and then do a forward roll or something like that. And just because it's fun to do that and see how you're reading the athletes. But like you were saying, I think about an athlete's confidence and the grinder. Like, I have kids that still can't really do a cartwheel. And if you can't do that, and I'm like, okay, we're doing cartwheels and rolls. And, it's like the last podcast we were just talking about Christian Thibodeau on the recent podcast I released, and people who, maybe they're that way a little bit because maybe there was something where they tried to be creative early in life and they failed and they felt bad about it. Or do you think about when people fail at something, if you're asking people to repeatedly do things in the weight room that they fail at, how is that? I mean, you probably need to get better at it, but I think for me, it's like a lot of my kids still have a smile on their face when they're still trying to do a cartwheel and they're terrible. And, but at the end of the day, just really that individual level, what feeds you, what makes you feel great about yourself. And then like the Ross Jeff's recent podcast, like, well, let's sprinkle in your weaknesses so it doesn't take away from, the great experience you have. And we'll try to bring that up over time. But at the end of the day, we need to have that foundation of you loving what you do and loving being in here. And yeah, man,
100%. And that's the one thing that I know there's going to be the subgroup that's listening to this and it's like, oh, this is soft, or oh, this is that, like they're not training, they're just doing whatever. And, to those people, like, screw off, right? Because like the reality is, look, when you're exposed to different demographics and different populations and different skill sets, if you don't humble yourself and realize how unnecessary you really are in this grand scheme, then you have this innate feeling of wanting to be important. And the one thing that I've realized through the ranks of going from low major all the way to professional is to realize, like, okay, my value isn't in the weight room necessarily. My value can be in any other means and methods. It could be, I'm the nail that's trying to keep the foundation together, or I'm the mortar that's trying to keep the bricks together. That you got to find value in that person's experience at their level. And what I mean by that, and this is going to get a little hokey, but what I mean by that is just because you create a system of progressive overload by using the big three or by using the big bang movements does not equate to wins or to experiences that lead to wins. I'm sorry, but if you think that those strength numbers driving up truly affects what happens in sport, then our sport would be very different. Like that's a sport of weightlifting for a reason. And that's where I get super excited about exploring other means and methods that are, your gymnastics, even mace work. That's where I'm getting a lot more creative with kettlebells. Is the term that you used earlier was exposing them to more athletic things. Well, even in that sense, like lifting heavy barbells, you don't have to be athletic. Like, period. Like, you don't have to be athletic to do those things. Quite the contrary, like athletic people aren't necessarily good at that, but yet we validate ourselves by those numbers going up. What I want to see is I want to put them in compression and then expression, and then put them in positions where they have to continuously find new ways to make that more efficient. And when I create ways to make their compression and expression more efficient, whether it's wedging them between a barbell or wedging them between the ground and the air, aka sprinting or jumping, that's to me the beauty of performance. not by validating it with, 315 on the bar, doing, 3 reps at 0.8 meters per second. Like that's just a totally different, that's a totally different topic. Because now I will say this though, when there's only one target to reach, like jumping higher because that is your sport, or running faster because that is your sport, your stuff has to become obviously a lot more narrow focused. But we're in team sports.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
awesome. Like they get exposed to all sorts of different means and methods of cutting, change of direction, jumping. There's an actual apparatus that they have to catch and throw, whether it's a basketball, football, a baseball bat, whatever. And you're telling me that, these traditional means and methods of just getting bigger, faster, stronger are what's going to directly correlate to, better success out there. I would say at low levels, yes. But after you tap that to like a year 1 to year 2 developmental standpoint, there's so many other things that you got to tap into to make it more efficient.
Yeah, and just from the sounds of it, you've worked with the college and then the pro, and just I really seeing where you fit in the grand scheme of things, and I think we have to, the more levels we work with, the more we can see that too, and especially that pro level. I always thought, there's not like a bench press competition before the game, and whoever benches the most gets 10 extra points. But even honestly in team sport, even there's not a vertical jump or a dunk contest before the game where you get an extra 5 points. There's not a sprint competition. It's even, and I say that even for my own, like I love jumping and sprinting, but I have to even understand that even that's not still the game. We want to make it better, but it's still not the game. And
outputs are fun. Don't get me wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Outputs are fun. Seeing outputs go up is fun. And once again, that's where you got to find a way to strategically put that into your training, because you do want to see yourself get better. And there's great means and methods and measures to show change over time. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but what I'm trying to illustrate in this is, if that's what you put all your eggs in that basket, then I think you're going to sell yourself short from creating an experience that's going to make their development long-term better, more so than their development short-term.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that with the eggs in the basket, because we want to jump higher and run faster and do things that we do in the game better. It's just the eggs in the basket where this being hyper focused on that versus being able to zoom out a little bit and just see some more connections. And that's good for me. That's good for me to remember and think about too. Sometimes I get my pendulum can swing pretty hard in different directions, and which is one of the reasons I really enjoy talking to you, Cory. But we got a lot of questions here, so let's roll through some of these. Yeah. Jack Anderson, I guess this one's more directed for you, asking you about the Sun Café. I don't know what the Sun Café is, but what's up with that?
Yeah. So what we tried to do was create an environment of autonomy, because I think there's a lot of power in autonomy, and that's something I used a lot at Stanford, especially in our in-season lifting, was to be able to, for them, the power of choice. I don't care what squat pattern a kid does. I really don't. They're generally going to find the one that they feel the most confident in doing, whether it's front squat, back squat, Zercher. Like, let's just use those 3 an example. If I expose an athlete to have those choices, and I got a 7-footer who has no mobility, he's going to figure out that Zercher is probably the best squat for him. Great. I create confidence. I create autonomy. They have power. They're like, oh, I chose this. And now that from a neck up and an intent standpoint, they're going to create more quote unquote stress response adaptation than I will ever create by saying, I think you should back squat because back squatting is better. Who cares, right? I just need to progressively overload something. And as long as it looks right and flies right, and the athlete feels confident about doing it, then there's going to be an adaptation, a positive one at that. And so that's what I did at Stanford, was creating, an environment where they actually got to choose the squat pattern or the extension pattern or whatever pattern that day for the meat and potatoes. And what I did was, in the professional setting, we did something very similar with our warm-ups. And we basically created a menu where it was like appetizers, salads, and then our entrees and desserts. And essentially it's the same idea. Now you build your plate. Here's a plate, or here's your menu, just like you go to a restaurant. What do you want to eat today? It's like, you know what? I just want sides. Some days you just want sides, which that would be our accessory list. Okay, great, man. Just hit your sides and, do whatever you need to do. Hey, but tomorrow I'm going to need that entree from you because, it's the timing. Oh yeah, I got you. So then they come in. All right. What's your entree today? Well, You have the choice between trap bar deadlift and front squat. Which one do you want to do? You know, and they're like, oh, I choose that one. And so that's the point of it, is where I don't care what the vessel is that's going to have this athlete acquire the certain stress that we're looking for that day. I just care about I just care about getting that stress. And I don't care in what form or fashion it comes in, whether it's a front squat, back squat, whatever. And so we tried to create this thing where it was the entire spectrum, all the way from their warm-ups to the very end, where it'd be their sides or desserts, so they can basically make their own plate and they create their own workout. The only thing we do is we influence it from, okay, these are the things we're going to make available on the menu, right? Like hey, you know what, today everybody's coming in. This is a day before a game, so maybe we want to work quote unquote speed, strength, or strength speed. Let's put those items on the menu. So they have to choose those. So we can influence what's on the menu. But once again, coming back to autonomy, they get to make the choice of whatever it is. So once again, I don't care what vessel it's delivered in. I just care about the actual or being able to influence the stress response that they want to adapt to. And from an intent standpoint, once again, like trying to create consistency, an environment where they want to keep coming into, and then driving intent. There's nothing more intentful than when I get to choose what I want to do. Like that's going to have the highest intent, not me over them going, back squats are going to do it. Let's go back squats. Like that's not going to do it, you know? And so that's where I think having that autonomy is going to drive more results, more so than me, you know, trying to predict their own success.
Yeah. I love that. I like, you think about a buffet, right? Like you don't plan out what you're going to eat at the buffet 2 weeks before. It's like there's a lot of intuition. You're not thinking, oh, I'm going to go to. Dude, I haven't been in a buffet or whatever. What's like a popular, like Golden Corral? There's not that many buffets
Yes.
in the Bay Area. There's just not.
There's not. You're so right.
But yeah, like I don't know. Yeah, I was in Ohio, Golden Corral, and you wouldn't plan like 2 weeks ahead. You don't go there because you planned out 2 weeks in ahead what you're. I mean, maybe some people do, but there's that being that that facilitator aspect. The more I've been around good coaches, the more I see continually like power in the hands of the athlete. And I used to just see it, you know, maybe 8-9 years ago, I was just starting to hear, I mean, I didn't do this at all when I was a track coach, when I was age 25 to 29. I mean, I had no clue. I'm like there. The interpersonal and coaching and athlete psychology thing has been something that has been the more slow and steady growing part of my own coaching. I was obsessed with the periodization and the exercises earlier in my life, but I didn't do any choice at all. And then I was just starting to hear at the tail end of that, whoa, there's coaches that actually give athletes menus when they're peaking, like, or let athletes pick the exercises. That was novel when I was 29, 30. And since that point, I've just seen coaches do that more and more. And you realize like what type of autonomy you can give them at different points of the year. And I'm just like, dude, this is it. This is this athlete-centered level. And we have to, I think to be able to do that too, you have to be able to, like you were saying before, like we think that we're so important sometimes. And when I can't put myself in the shoes of an athlete and know what they're thinking, let alone what their body wants to do on the day, their intuition, like what feels good to you. I mean, that's a critical step to make. And I like, seeing how you've done that with your menu and giving them that level over time of autonomy.
Well, you said one so important word in there. You said critical. And that's the one thing that I don't think a lot of strength coaches have is critical thinking skills. Like, in my opinion, it has, X has to equal Y to equal Z. And there's no other way that can be done. And for someone to have the confidence to go in and give autonomy to athletes, you have to have such a layer of critical thinking skills to where the athlete well enough to understand what their needs are. The athlete knows themselves well enough to know what they want to do that day. What your goal is to put them in an environment where both needs of that is going to be met. And to me, that's where you're going to get to the quote unquote peak faster, more efficient and effective. Now, don't get me wrong. There's going to be times where it's like, man, today was a complete wash. But how many times have we seen that when you try to program a 5-week cycle or whatever? Like, so many wash days, they walk in and they look like crap, and you're like, well, today's max effort day, so you got to do max effort work, so I don't care. And then, you just put them in the hole harder, and you're like, well, you just did more damage, more so than you guys experimenting around or playing around with a new exercise and didn't really get any load with it. At least they got some, like, to me, at least lymphatically, they got something done. They got to leave the session feeling better. So maybe that helps them recover more before going into their next deal. But that's the one thing that you said is like that one word, critical. And a lot of people don't have those critical thinking skills that will allow them to create this environment for these things to happen. And it's hard when you're in team sport because now you got to consider multiple athletes. And, for me, it's a lot smoother than it is for like a football team. Now that's different, right? You got 50 dudes and you're running a factory. Like those guys, like, hey man, all the credit in the world. You're doing the best that you possibly can with the means that you got. Luckily, you already have strong athletes. So, you get to play around with some other variables. Me, on the other hand, I worked in, a crazy population where their biomechanics, if you will, is so interesting. Like everything about them, they're very rare human beings. And for me to take traditional training and traditional thought processes and periodization models and et cetera, and try to apply it to this very specific type of human, who's in a different type of environment, aka playing basketball on a hardwood surface, it's very, very different. And it's you cannot just take those traditional means and think it's going to cause this stress response adaptation just like it does to all other humans that are in different scenarios. That's where I have always drifted towards so many different means and methods and variety because I want to make them better athletes. And, just because they do a between the legs dunk doesn't make them a good athlete. I mean, that's just one aspect of athleticism. The things that make them good, I'm all in favor for. But going back to our original question, to the first question, you got to find means and methods that exposes them to different stressors that will allow them to continue to do those things. And I think that's the most important part is, okay, if you're awesome at vertical jumping or you're awesome at, your reactivity is unbelievable, like your elasticity is great. Okay, great. But that doesn't last for 10 years in an NBA season or an NBA career. I mean, Vince Carter is a great example of that. Was he doing crazy windmill dunks at the end of his career? Absolutely not. So he had to shift his focus and became a way better he became a more skillful and more experienced athlete. And that's what kept the runway going for him, right? He still had value. And that's what you got to do. And for these athletes, you got to find a way to increase their longevity and increase their value. And sometimes it's giving them things that they're not good at.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by SimpliFaster. Oh yeah,
how did we get there? Sorry, I digress.
I don't know. It's a good example though. I was going to say too. I'll leave it with this because we got a few more. I mean, there's no way we're going to get to all these questions, but that's fine. No, I mean, this would be like a 5-hour show at this rate. Anyways, so yeah, sorry. Maybe we'll have to have around 2 or 3 later on with just the questions we got. But I was thinking about too, like basketball, super chaotic. Not only super chaotic, but a ton of different body types from the point guard to the center versus a sport like, the cross country. Or I know there's a lot of like track people listening to this too. Or I think about Bondarchuk's training system where, there's no variation in you're training just till you hit adaptation. But so there's a system outside of that. I just think about there's probably a little spectrum. Like if I'm training distance runners, I may give them some days where they get a little bit of a choice. But at the end of the day, it's more about the mileage or some of the external parameters where the more chaotic and the more decisions and the more different types of athletes you have, it just seems like that need for really purposefully planning that stuff in there probably increases. I think it's important no matter what. But I would imagine that might be more important in basketball than it might be in like a more singular element sport.
Right. And that's where, at the end of the day, though, and this is the truth, once again, coming back to the subgroup, that's probably like, well, they don't train or anything. Don't get me wrong. You have to get work done. Let's not forget that. We got to get work done. But for me, the biggest low hanging fruit to get work done, isometrics. Mm-hmm. Isometrics, eccentrics. And I know we got a question on that, so we can probably
let's just roll into it. Yeah. Your favorite isometrics. Right, cool. Here we go.
So my favorite isometric is, there's 2, because once again, if you do one, you got to have the complementary one on the other end of the spectrum to get it done. My favorite is a yielding isometric at the sporting angles that they create the most often. So when I think of the one that's the most explosive, is probably a quarter squat at plantar flexion, right? That's the one where they express the force, right? Like that quote unquote where the amortization phase meets, right? I love doing that one, yielding, for a multitude of reasons, but that's the one I want to load up the most, right? And then there's the other end where it's completely unloaded, where you get them in their most weakest position, which is probably for basketball players because they're so taped and braced year round that they don't have that full plantar flexion. And that's the one where it's like that last little bit of a push off is super weak. So I assist them. I allow them to push down on a fixed object to allow them to get an extra range, and then have them just hold that for dear life. Just keep holding to give them that strength. So it's that when we reverse that, it's that initial contact when they strike the ground would have a little bit more resistance before they get from just hit, fall, and then find that area where there is strength and then ease into it. And the reason why I say that is because I know that's what was missing with my Achilles when I tore it. Is my lack of plantar flexion at the top, like the strength to be able to actually hold the very tip top. I would land and then I would fall to a position to where I finally got some strength, and then it'll just load up that tissue I mean, there's some other reasons why, especially from a foot standpoint, but I know for a fact that I was missing that last bit. So those are my two favorite ISOs.
Yeah, that's the whole plantar flexion into, because we can take this into the Achilles talk too. And I would say too, well, before we do that, because I'm going to come back to that, so where was I going with this? Okay.
Well, what is your favorite ISOs?
Yeah, I was going to say, I should probably throw a few answers in here too. Okay. So for me, I think just being a strength coach in the sense of where my work is very much, being a track coach for 6 years and then being a strength coach. I mean, I was doing both through, but it's, I've gone to a place where the extreme isometrics from a resiliency and a base standpoint and using that as a staple has been a real big one. And so from just a general perspective, iso lunge and then iso push up and hanging. Like those are my real big three. Super simple. Everyone should be able to do these. Everyone should get to a solid baseline of these. Working with swimmers too, I've noticed that you start to put things together when you put someone in an iso push up and you see what happens, or an iso lunge and you see what happens. And so, yeah, keeping it simple, those have been my real big three, and everyone does those in some level and should be at some level of capacity. The iso lunge I love and appreciate more every year, and even going through Gary Ward's stuff, and I was working with Rocky Snyder yesterday, who's also going to be on this podcast coming up. And he was just showing how even in just regular walking lunges, going into the pelvis and the opposition, and how the front leg kind of needs to flex and the back leg needs to extend into the point. And if you do the extreme iso lunge the way that Jay Schrader, would have it, you're really extending that back leg hard. And this is the gait pattern. Like this is what your pelvis actually does when you're moving. And we get people, Darian Barr talks about people who are stuck in various ways. They might be stuck front, stuck back, or we talk about people who are stuck in anterior tilt or anything like that. Like we can really take that pelvic action out in the gait pattern, and people feel better after that. And so I'm constantly just seeing how, and the cool thing is in isometrics too, you can't screw up human movement in the sense of, if we squat enough and we just are pushing our knees out and going through our heels on everything, you're gonna screw up human movement. And I think if we screw it up, I think weights can screw it up a lot, because if I think about anything, I'm trying to see more and more the gait cycle show up in everything, except for like the really heavy loaded stuff. You have to be like, you can't the heavy squat the same way you jump with the triangle. It's just, I mean, you can, but I would be hesitant. I would be hesitant. I would be hesitant to really because to fit this ideal, let's really triangle up the squat. And so anyways, I just say that because I think of it as allowing us to maintain a more purity of a movement, and doing that as a greater percentage of what we do. And then for, like the performance driven side, like I love I'll throw this in French contrast if we're getting to that, is I love leading off a French contrast with that heavy yielding iso. Like a heavy ass quarter squat. For me, I've always responded really well, because that's more my jump range, or someone else might be a little lower. But I was weak as hell in a deep squat, but I could throw over 500 on that quarter and hold it, for however long, and and then everything else in that circuit would be better. And so, it's kind of, those are my two splits of that. And that's what I like to do with it all.
I love that. And the one thing you said in there that I mean, been a huge advocate of is hanging. Like, talk about shoulder health. Oh my gosh. And then grip strength, just in general. Like, hanging has been a huge staple of mine ever since my like first years at UAB. But that's where you'll find out more about an athlete if you just have them hang than anything else, in my opinion. Like, if I was to pick one health assessment to do, like, remember the presidential fitness test?
Oh yeah.
Bro, like, first off, what happened to it? I don't know if it's in
Yeah.
existence anymore, but that's one that across the board you can do from kindergarten all the way to your senior year in high school. That's a great assessment for everything. Because if you're a fat kid, well, you're not going to hang long. Okay, cool. Well, that's one thing that we already know, right? And if you're a weak kid, you're not going to hang long either. But if you're relatively strong for your own body weight, you're going to be able to hold, and then you're going to be able to advance it with maybe a single arm hold, or then maybe make it more isodynamic where you're actually going from, monkey bar to monkey bar. Like, these are things that it'll show up in multiple facets just with one test alone, which is an iso hold. And you can take that obviously with lunging, and you can take that obviously with heavy quarter squatting and make it more performance based. Like, that's where thanks to you, I've been more like driven to like, okay, everybody's talking about isometrics. So like, there's got to be something there, right? And then you have Keith Barr, and you're like, oh, wow, like, oh, that makes a lot more sense the way he puts it. So, looking at some of these brilliant individuals that are really applying it at a high level, but at the end of the day, it's the safest way of creating force. Like, the safest way. Like, you can't, like you said, you can't screw it up. Like, you can't screw up isometrics. And when I think from like a specific exercise standpoint, one of my favorites to load up is a safety squat bar split with a hack filled hold. So what I mean by that is, if anyone knows what a hack filled squat is, that's where you have a safety squat bar, aka a bar that hangs on or that is placed on your back, and you don't need to use your hands to hold it. So you can do like a squat without using your hands. And then the hack filled aspect of it is where there's a barbell or some type of immovable object in front of you where you can put your hands on to help support you, so that you can almost create an assistance on the squat. So what I like to do is split it, have an active foot, if you will, or a floating heel, split it, hang at the bottom, and then because now I can truly overload it, because now I have stability. Because the single leg, obviously, or with split squat stance, you're creating instability because of your stance that you're in. But as soon as I can put my hands on something and create more stability, I can create a ton more load, especially when I get into that position. Because that's the hardest thing to do, right? Like, if you're doing a heavy split squat, it's getting into the position. It's not holding the position. Once you're finally like centered, you're like, okay, I can hold this for forever. I need to hold it for until my grip strength gives out or whatever. But the reason why I like using the hack field is because it'll give you extra tonnage to put you into that position. And then from there, just let it go. Like that you just have your hands hovering. And now I just overloaded what I thought I could do, because now I had the assistance and stability to get me into that position. And then I'm always there safely to grab onto at any moment. And that's what I think. So that, when we're talking about favorite, like, that's my favorite actual exercise from a very specific standpoint.
I've noticed that you can load athletes up way more when the safety measure is 100%. Like, in the sense of, I've had athletes who wouldn't want to squat more than 185, but then you put them in a situation where it's like, I like functional isometrics, where it's like, look, just lift this up 1 inch off the pin and hold it. Like, if you don't have a force plate, like out to do Alex Natera stuff, and they'll go way more than what their squat. You remove the fear factor, and now it's just all you and the bar, and there's that motor outputs. And I've done something similar in the sense of, I've enjoyed doing like a split stance. I don't know what you call this, but where the bar is, you're in a lunge and the bar is in a rack below you, and it's basically between your legs, and you're pulling up, kind of like a Jefferson deadlift setup, but with a lunge, and you're pulling from like a low bar into pins, and you can do a ton of weight in that. And I love pairing that with acceleration work. It just seems to fit really well. And yeah, that stuff's where it's at, man. I know some people asked us some foot stuff, some floating heel stuff, some Achilles stuff. I know, well, you have torn your Achilles, and you had said that, not having that. But what was interesting, I remember we were talking about this at one of the Rewire clinics with the Darian Bars. You used to have kind of duck feet, and then you manually like turn them in, right? Or something like that. Like, didn't someone tell you to do that, or what was the deal there?
Yeah, you're 100% right. I was in college, and I don't know where I got this from, but it's like, oh, Cory, man, you walk with your feet like out. Like, you got to turn those things in and walk straight. And I was so conscious about it at that point. Like, I was almost insecure. I'm like, God, do I walk like a, like, do I walk, like, do I not have swag in my walk? Like, I'm sorry, if you're in basketball and you have a weird looking walk, like, you got to be cool, man. Like, that's not a cool walk if you're waddling. You know what I mean? I was like, dang, I thought I had a pretty sweet stride just walking to class, you know? And then when someone made that comment, I'm like, oh my God. And it was someone that was from a health perspective too. I think it was, I think our head athletic trainer or somebody. No, I think it was like maybe a professor or something like that in our biomechanics. I don't know. But anyways, so I was like, oh, I got to straighten my feet out. I got to straighten my feet out. Well, if you look at my structure, like I'm not significantly bow-legged, but I'm bow-legged. And then I don't have any calves whatsoever. And, you know, I have decently developed quads and glutes. So I'm sitting there like, well, what am I really doing by that? And reality, I think I messed myself up, like significantly. I think I messed myself up. And I look at like LeBron James, and I'm not saying we're the same person by any stretch of the imagination, but when you watch that dude walk, you're like, Jesus, is he like on a horse? Like, I mean, like, he's so straddled, if you will, and externally rotated, and he's the best athlete on the planet. You know, and I'm like, well, dang, man, maybe there was something to that. And so, you know, years later, I mean, I know when I create force, I externally rotate my foot. And if you watch or had a camera on me from behind and I take off sprinting, you know, I know I go into external rotation like hard. I open up my hip and I push, and then I go into plantar flexion, and then it rolls over. And over the years, because of, you know, all these other interventions, I started developing such a bad tendinosis, like so bad. But I was also weighing 220 pounds on top of a faulty structure that I was trying to do all these other mechanics to make me correct, if you will. And what happened is I was dealing with tendinosis for a year. I was trying to be that, you know, meathead that was like, oh, I'm good. It's just sore. I would literally wake up in the morning. It would take me 10 minutes to be able to walk normal, just to get rid of it. I'd walk on my heels down the stairs because I could not walk on the ball of my foot because it brings so much pain. And in my head, I'm like, oh, it's just tendinosis. You know, I'll do some isometrics here. I'll do this, and it'll all get better over time. And I'll take some supplements. And then, you know, I felt just good enough to play pickup, and I landed on someone's foot, and my tendon was so bad that, you know, 99% of the time, when you land on someone's foot, you're going to roll it. Well, I didn't roll it. It just stuck, and I just snapped it backwards. Because no one, like, I don't know many people that have torn their Achilles landing on someone's foot. I know a lot of people who do it themselves. They create on their own fruition. Like they have that quick reactivity, and then they go and, you know, like tear their own Achilles. But I did it by like a contact injury. And I was like, man, that shit should have just rolled. Mm-hmm. Like I should have just rolled my ankle, and which is, I'm not saying is a good thing, but it'd have been a lot better than tearing my Achilles. But my Achilles tendon was so weak and so compromised that it's like, nope, that's the weaker structure. So my forces are going to go towards the least amount of force, which is unfortunately dorsiflexion.
Yeah, when you were telling that story, it was making me think of, and I've learned a lot of this from like Gary Ward stuff and David Gray, but the idea of when you're turning your feet in, you're creating a supination. And like we talk a lot about dorsiflexion range and what's your dorsiflexion. But if you're on a supinated foot, well, you got bones running into each other, and anything to go beyond that is going to be just like messing stuff up. Like you're going to be getting the ligaments or weird stuff with Achilles. So I was thinking, I didn't even know you'd land on someone's foot, but in my mind, I'm like, well, if you have a foot that's dorsiflexion limited because of the joint block, and now you're like jammed into it, right? Like that's gonna be a rough one. And
that's what it was, because it was at the insertion. It was at the heel. Like it wasn't like at the belly or anything like that. It was at the heel. And so that's when it was just such, like when they opened me up, they're like, that tendon was so bad, Cory. Like it was just frayed. Like, so it didn't like tear like a pop or anything like that. It was just basically frayed off. Like you would be a good example of that. Like, you know, the frayings on a blanket.
Yeah.
Like that would be the way of describing it. Like that's the only thing that was left, was just fraying off the bone. And you're just like, man, like that is just atrocious to think about.
Yeah, no, I don't want to think about it right now. You're like, yeah, dude, if I've learned anything though, just like, and really this has just been like the last few years is just, and with my own Achilles, because I've had Achilles issues too. So it's like, you got a question that really deals with both of us here. And for me, it was just getting the joints to move, getting the calcaneus to move, and realizing that our Achilles is at the mercy of other joints. And for me, it's like, if my calcaneus is not moving, then, well, the Achilles has to do more. And it's just, yeah, for me. So I for my answer to that question, I think there's a lot of ways to hit it. And then, but my real core of it all has gotten into, can the bones of your foot move as they're supposed to? And it's nice to have young kids too. I got kids 2 and 3, so I'm always watching their feet when they walk. Like, they just have such a good little tripod, and I'm like, man, I wish I could get back to this. I'm working on it. So it's
that's so interesting to say that, because I think specifically with the basketball population, like you said, like as kids, they'll do it naturally. They'll have that nice little tripod, but then like the older you get, it's like, man, I need those new Nikes. I need those new this. I need these new that. And then you're just constantly changing footwear. And for me, like in the basketball population, I see guys play in new pairs of shoes every single game. Like they won't wear the same shoe twice, and I'm like, goodness, man. You can't say anything at that point. You're just like, well, you just hold on. Or then you have your interventions where you're like, okay, I guess we're doing a lot of footwork, because that's probably the only thing I need to do with you based on what your behavior is in the environment you're creating.
Yeah, that's crazy. New pair of shoes every game. I wonder, like, what happens to those old shoes? I'm sure, like, tons of people would want to wear, like,
And so, hey, if you, hopefully you are befriended one of them and they wear the same size. Because if you're in that case, you are on the come up. Like,
yeah. Oh yeah, like size 18 or something. Like, how many people out there are going to be able to? Yeah, exactly. Floating heel stuff. Someone asked about floating heel too. I know you do a lot of that. I've kind of gotten in that world a little bit, at least, considering a lot of that. And I know Cal Dietz has talked about, moving a majority or a large portion or a very big portion of his bilateral squatting into that mode. What's your experience been with the floating heel, and how have you gotten into that, and experiences? How often do you use that with your population?
Yeah, it was very similar. Like Cal was the one that really brought this to light, like to make it popular and to make it like, okay, well, there's something to this. But like just from an observational standpoint, like yesterday, I think on SportsCenter, they had it on their Instagram feed of that kid who jumped on that Just Jump mat and had like a 47.1 standing vert or whatever. And I just watched his heels, and they didn't even come close to the ground. Like, he was so stiff, like it didn't even come close to the ground when he was loading. And I'm sitting there like, oh man, like it makes a lot of sense, or it doesn't make much sense to me when you see heavy back squatting, when everything shifted to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the heels. And then you think about running and jumping, and I'm like, when is your heels ever touching the ground during any of that? And you're like, oh wait, never. So for me, it made a lot of sense, because once again, like my lower leg complex is so compromised that I realized I'm training everything else to be strong, but my foot and ankle. When you do heavy squatting and you're in heels and you're loading your backside and you're doing everything you can to, just get a more powerful squat, you realize, okay, I'm making my glutes stronger. I'm making my hips stronger. I'm making all these other things stronger, but I'm not making the thing that I need to be the strongest, which is the thing that comes into contact with the ground, which is my foot and the ankle. And that's where it's like, oh no, like, how do I now rectify this? And it's like, well, you got to take a humble pill big time, because now that load's got to decrease by like at least, 50% when you're first starting off on now integrating that into your bilateral squatting. Because to be able to maintain that position, and that's where you need apparatuses that will create stability for that, like a Smith machine. I love a Smith machine. I think a Smith machine is one of the greatest tools you can use, especially with longer levered athletes. But you can have them doing their active foot bilateral squatting on a Smith machine, and now balance isn't the issue. And then you upgrade them, right? Now, all it is taking you put them in an environment to load. So now I'm getting the specific stress that I'm looking for. And then you add complexity by now taking the stability aspect away from it. And then when you have stability and load, well, congratulations, you got hopefully a positive adaptation.
I like that progression too. I mean, I think a lot of athletes, there might be some athletes who have super good sensation in their feet and balance and be fine. And to be honest, I actually can almost squat more with my heels, standing on 2 plates with my heels off the ground than I can with everything on. I think it's just because I'm so that's just my jam, an elastic athlete, right? But I think about Gary Ward and then David Gray mentioned this on my podcast a while ago, but he's like to pronate the foot properly, you have to be able to load the forefoot effectively. You have to be able to load that transverse arch, the balls of the feet. And if you can't do that, you're not going to get proper pronation. And then I think about how we oftentimes coach these lifts. Like maybe we could say through our heels, maybe we don't, but usually it's knees out. It's something that's supinating the athlete.
Right.
And like if we do that enough, what's happening with the forefoot? What's happening with pronation? I'm not going to say it's probably not going to happen to you in a month, if you do stuff like that, but I don't know, take someone in knees out, squat them, and supination squat them for a year or two. And I think you might start to see some changes that you might not want to see. And so I think about that forefoot squat too with let's put the ground down for a proper pronation. Let's put the ground down to let this foot operate the way you're supposed to. And then try squatting knees out too with you could do it, right? But try squatting knees out, try jamming, yourself in that typical position with the foot. You could do it, but it just doesn't connect. It's like, wait, this isn't how I'm supposed to move when I have my heels off the ground, really? I get you're a little more bow-legged than I am, so you might have a little more than me, but to force someone to that position it's like, wait, what am I doing? I'm on the balls of my feet. I'm athletic now. Shouldn't I be a little more neutral? What's going on here? So yeah, I love that stuff.
And that's where you just look at, great sprinters, or when you're trying to develop great sprinters, if you will, in the team sport aspect. The one thing that I do the most when identifying energy leaks is super heavy prowler pushes. Right? You take a sled and you push them really, get them to go super heavy, body weight plus, and then watch the first thing that goes back in their heel. All of a sudden they go into extreme dorsiflexion and you're like, yeah, that's the weakest thing. And we're basketball players, it's 90% of the time. But then you got your guys that can really go, that are super elastic. And the first thing that gives out is actually their hips. And then their heels stay super rigid.
Yeah, that's
they stay in that plantar flexion. And then you go, okay, well, that's that energy leak. And once again, isometrics, you basically get them to doing an isometric sprint. You put them in that very specific position and just look for energy leaks. And coming back to the isometric, that's what's so great about isometrics. You put them in a position long enough, you're going to find out where their energy leaks are. You're going to find out where they're compromised. And not only from a training, stress response, adaptation, whatever standpoint, you're seeing it from an assessment. Here's an easy assessment. If I put them in an active foot with just body weight and you see that heel just bouncing up and down, you know that they're muscularly trying to get the job done. And at some point that's got to give out. And that means the tendon's not doing the job that it needs to do. And then eventually you start seeing their training, you start loading them up. All of a sudden that heel stops bouncing. They become more tendon oriented. They become, loading the structure that you want them to load, or they finally relax their musculature to allow them to get, the tendons to be able to do the job that they're supposed to do. And you see it in real time. And I didn't have to do a single split. I didn't have to do a single eccentric, concentric action to get that job done.
Yeah. Like how you said, the prowler push was the original squat on the heels floating squat if you do it right, because
yes,
it's the original.
That's such a good way of putting it.
Yeah, because it's funny. I mean, you watch so many sled pushes, and it's just that heel's getting slammed straight down the ground. It's what are we really reinforcing here?
Right.
This is not a good way to connect your forefoot to your glute. That's for sure, and it's probably a good way to teach yourself to tear your Achilles too. Especially if you're dropping into that split step and that back foot's heel slamming in the ground, and you overstretch that thing. It's
and that's how you see most Achilles tears, is that false step. They take that false step and then right into that forward. But yeah, it's really interesting.
All right. So I think we got time for one more last question, or maybe some related ones. And I know a couple people indicated asking about progressing power development or strength development in light of an athlete's skill development. So I suppose that could mean a few things based off where in the season it is, total off season or whatnot. But maybe let's just say in the context of, you're practicing a fair amount, you're not in the competitive season yet. How does your ideas on strength, how is that impacted by all the skill work they're trying to get better at?
So this is a topic I'm very passionate about, actually, because when I look at track and field, Like, I feel like track and field is the purest form of this. The greatest track coaches were also the greatest strength coaches, right? They were the all-encompassing of knowledge of everything across the spectrum to make that athlete perform better, right? You had to be more skillful at the running or the technical aspects of running. You had to develop, the strength, power, and et cetera, in the weight room to help complement that. And if it didn't, you know how it didn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when we talk about it in a team sport setting, the skill coach or the individual coach that helps develop these skills, like, I think all of it can be done within the sport itself. That's where, in conjunction to, if I was to truly plan out for someone to become more explosive, quote unquote, or someone to jump higher, well, I want to do it in the context of their sport, right? And so the last thing I want to do is, if we're also trying to develop skill, is to rob them of their resources to develop that skill. And if I'm in the weight room trying to get all these outputs from them that could blunter or have a negative impact on the skill work that they're trying to develop on the court, then I did everyone a disservice. And in early stages, with an athlete, like if you're, anywhere between 15 to 21 years old, maybe a little bit later, that maybe you're so plastic that you can handle it. Like maybe you have such a reservoir to where you can do it both or all of it at once. But the older the athlete gets, the last thing you want to do is rob them of their resources to develop that skill more. So let's take, for example, I want an athlete to dunk, right? Well, dunking is a skill, but you have to have extreme outputs to get the job done, especially if you're just getting to that point where you're dunking. So why don't we coordinate the actual technical session or the technical session that they're doing it within the confines of the sport, and maybe track that, opposed to me also doing very similar things in the weight room. What I want to do is I want to complement that. And if I'm complementing that, I'm doing it in a sense where I'm doing the exact opposite end of the spectrum, or maybe it's isometrics, eccentrics, not necessarily the outputs or the concentric based work. And so that's where, once again, let's take the sport itself, reverse engineer it. Okay, how can I affect that output that they're doing on the court with the most, without doing more output work in the weight room? Because that's the one thing I see the most of. And I think back in my college career, was I actually building more power? Was I building all these things that I thought I was building by trying to build it in a weight room with a bunch of cleans and snatches, while simultaneously they were trying to get better at sport? Or was I robbing them of those resources to allow their motor learning, or to allow them to coordinate better, to make them better at the synchronization that it takes to go from point A to point B, to take that ball and rip it across the body into a 1-2 step and get above the rim and dunk it? So that's where I'm very passionate about this subject, because I think if you're a really good strength coach and you've cornered yourself into a market, for instance, for me, it's basketball, that you now have to truly go over onto the sport coaching side. As far as from the technical skill standpoint, you got to understand and feel and know how to move. Luckily, I played college basketball at the lowest level, but I played. I played longer than most strength coaches, where now you can actually get onto the court and feel it and go, okay, I need to coordinate this. I need X, Y, and Z. And then I know the resources it took for me to do that technical skill on the court that just so happened to have a large output physically, that I now know, okay, in the weight room, this is how I'm going to complement those outputs to help give it more of a base to increase, more so than say, oh, well, let's do let's do power cleans from the floor, concentric base, when they're already doing that on the court.
Yeah, I like, I didn't play college ball, but I played high school ball. And in going through all that, it's, putting yourself in the shoes of the player, it's hard to think about all your brain being so on trying to go through tactics and the technical elements, and then all the skills your body's doing as well. And now you're going to go in the weight room and learn a bunch of other skill. You know what I'm saying? It's just a lot. And so I like, when I was playing in high school, I would just after practice, I remember I mean, we didn't have a strength coach when I was in high school. I don't even know what the other guys did, but I would always go after practice. I'd go home and I'd eat dinner, and then I'd actually lift at like 8 at night. But it was always just like, all I had mental energy for was just like 1 or 2 lifts, and they weren't complex. It was just, for the most part, like maybe a set of barbell step ups, some push ups or something. Like, it was never, I think I was into cleans a little bit like my sophomore year, but which isn't, it's good. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I just felt like the more, like, leaving the complexity to the court. And I think that, like, Olympic lifts, maybe in the off season, we aren't playing any basketball. Like, I do think it's good to learn new skills in that transition period when you're not playing ball, and do something else that's mentally fun. If you like learning cleans, or I don't know, maybe you like playing tennis, or I don't know, like something that's not your sport. But I will say, you mentioned the isos, and I've been having some pretty big realizations with this, is that especially the bodyweight isos, I feel like and I've been working out a little bit with Alex Lee, who was on this podcast. He was mentored and trained by Dr. Tommy John, and he had noticed, and I feel the same thing with the bodyweight isos, that it almost improves, or it improves your coordination in the game for whatever reason. And I had an anecdote that I saw where I was recently, this with myself, I was doing a ton of like iso push-ups and that type of, and iso lunges and everything else. But I like to do free handstand holds for time every now and then. And after doing like maybe 3 weeks of just really getting after the extreme isos, I go up in my handstand hold that I hadn't practiced for a while, and did like 3 times longer. And so it was something that, I don't know, maybe it's like the coordination the brain needs to hold that position under some level of fatigue. I don't really know, but I think that a lot of people who have done that type of thing would say the same thing. And so that's just the anecdote on mine where I think about the isometrics. If I'm going to be doing complex like crazy playing my sport, maybe to take things, just start with that simplest, most bare bones thing, and then try not to offset that skill, or how can I complement your skill? How can I not try to take too many things away? So,
and that, I love that, like, we're not robbing them of you've increased, like, you had a specific skill, handstand, like, that's a skill. Like, you see it in CrossFit games, you see it all, like, that's a skill to be able to do that. And you didn't do that. You did something that's exact opposite, actually. Like, you got to more stability, which is a push-up hold, and then you just hold it for a longer duration because you have more stability and it's a more favorable position. And then sure enough, your handstand got better. Like, that's where it's like, you didn't do explosive handstands. Mm-hmm. You didn't do, like, you know what I'm saying? You didn't take, double your body weight above your head and hold it. You did something that was just very simple, and it didn't rob you of that resource. And so that's where I'm like, from an isometric standpoint, I think a very easy blend is, you start off your session, if you're doing skill work, you do a quote unquote potentiation, right? Like, so maybe you're doing an isometric that is like an IMTP, right? Like, you're doing something to increase a ton of motor units, right? And then you contrast it with skill, right? Then you're going into the skill, which in this case, the skill is high outputs. So it's dunks, right? And then you end the session with more of the yielding, or more of the holds, where it's going to be a lot longer. And you didn't rob any resources there. You complemented it. You created more motor unit activity. You created all these things to help your skill to potentiate and explore your skill set to create more force. And then you did the exact opposite. Then you went and just did yielding isometrics, which will now increase the robustness of the things that you've been trying to do so that you can do it longer. Awesome. Like, if you ask me, like, that, you don't really need strength coaches anymore. You just take the skill coach and teach them very simple things like that. And then there you go. Like, you got the best strength coach on the planet right there, because it's affecting the skill. It's affecting what they actually do on the court. And, strength coaches are probably not happy with me saying things like that because it's their job security, but that tide ain't going to change for a while. But I'm telling you, strength coaches, it's coming. You better start getting well-versed, and you better be able to demonstrate skills on the basketball court or on the football field or wherever you're doing, because what you see in football is football strength coaches are football players, ex-football players. Mm-hmm. You don't see ex-basketball players being football strength coaches, but you damn sure see football strength coaches who become basketball strength coaches. You see that all the time. So it's very rare that you have a basketball strength coach who actually played the game basketball at a high level. You generally never see that. Like, it's such a small percentage. It's ridiculous. I've never seen a football strength coach become a sprint coach. Like, I don't know. I haven't seen that.
No, I haven't either.
Opposite. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, you got to dive into the sport at some point. And because if you don't, who's to say a sport coach doesn't pick up easy strength, and then all of a sudden they're the best strength coach because they're mixing in the skill, and then buy, your sprint book.
Yeah. Go plug that. Books. Yeah. Go ahead and plug that one. Yeah.
That plug. You buy those 2 books if you're a sport coach, and next thing you know, you probably know more than the strength coach.
I do think that I've definitely been thinking about just the power of, if you are a sport coach and you just learn extreme isometrics and, like you said, easy strength, something that's very simple. There is a lot of power in that. There is a lot of power in that. And so I also like, I was just thinking, you said football strength coaches, and in talking to football strength coaches, and Scott Salwasser was on recently. It's like, and he was an ex-football player. Like, man, Scott, you know so much about the game. Like, they're sitting on the sidelines looking at the plays. Like, they're at every practice. They're trying to set up their agility and perception reaction work to match eventually what is going to be needed.
Yep.
Like this. It is getting closer and closer together, and you can't deny that. And I think that it's, like you said, it's really important to really get, you better get well versed in those skills, and then I think on the other layer down, how the human body moves and works and how joints move. It's I don't think it's going to be enough to just live in barbells only, like, just putting up 1 rep maxes. And yeah, man. Shoot, I think that's about the questions that we have time for. Okay. We probably got about 3 other podcasts worth, but hopefully we covered at least some of the main topics. I at least had these topics lined out. I think we hit about at least 1 or 2 in every bucket, so to speak. So, man, it was good doing this, Cory. Yeah, we'll have to look at the rest of those questions some other time. We didn't even get to the what kind of shoe would you make one, but we'll brainstorm on that. We'll brainstorm.
Sounds like a plan, Joel. I appreciate you, brother.
Yeah, appreciate you, Cory. Thanks, man. Thanks for listening to another show. Appreciate you guys being here and being a part of this podcast. If you enjoy what we're doing, you can help us out by leaving us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to the show on. Also, want to give a last shout out to our sponsor, SimpliFaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology, amazing blog, and amazing store as well. So be sure to support them, as they've been a longtime supporter of this show. All right, we'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.